Hi everybody in Psych 266 Abnormal Psychology. We are now starting videos that go along with the book. We were doing the reading packet at first, did 6 of those screencast videos, but now the book. This is what you'll need, DSM-5 Made Easy. So these videos, if you spend time watching them, will actually save you time because I am going to tell you what you need to know exactly and what you don't need to know. There's a lot of information in this book and you don't need to know all of it to do well on the exam. So today, Chapter 1, Neurodevelopmental Disorders. Now, you've already learned what the DSM is, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's actually published by the American Psychiatric Association, not psychological. That's the 5th edition. It came out in 2014, or actually late 2013. It was put into use a few months later by most people. In the previous DSM versions, 1, 2, 3, and 4, there was a chapter on childhood disorders. They now break it down a little more specifically, and the first chapter is neurodevelopmental disorders. It's not broadly called childhood disorders anymore. So we're now talking about problems of development, and the assumption is that there are problems within the nervous system. Most often the brain, but it could be other parts of the nervous system as well. So let's get started with the ones that you need to know for the exam. I'm sure that's what you're most interested in. Intellectual disability. It is possible for a child to develop an intellectual disability for cultural and environmental reasons. You know, you're just not exposed to learning when you're growing up. Maybe you are abandoned, neglected, all kinds of things like that. But what we're talking about here in this chapter is things that go wrong neurodevelopmentally. That's why it's in this chapter. So, intellectual disability, in previous versions of the DSM, it was called mental retardation. Why did they change the name? Well, I'm sure there's multiple reasons, but one of them is definitely retarded has become a bad word. That's become a very judgmental word. And so therefore, intellectual disability is perhaps more appropriate. 2 things. 1, you have to have an IQ below 70, although there is a little wiggle room in that. You could be slightly above 70 if there are other problems that are noticed. And you lack adaptive functioning. There are tests that can be given to parents, teachers, caregivers, and yes, even the child. Do they have the skills that someone their age should have? Can you tie your shoes at a certain age? Can you eat with a spoon and fork at a certain age? Are you able to read and write? Do you know your phone number, your address? Do you know just basic things, and do you have basic skills? So, quick story. I work in our disabilities department at Chandler Gilbert. I don't just teach psychology classes. Sometimes we get paperwork from a person's childhood, like even a high school IEP, and we notice some interesting things. Maybe somebody has a low IQ noted, upper 60s, lower 70s, and we're thinking, wow, how is this person ever going to succeed in college? Well, what if we read a little further and the person was tested on a day that he or she was sick? Or maybe that person didn't speak English very well and that's the language the test was given in. Or the person had a bad attitude when they were a teenager. A lot of teenagers do, by the way. It could have been a number of factors. And maybe there's no lack of adaptive functioning. That person passes standardized tests, they hold down a job, they have a driver's license, seems like things are going okay. But what if I read another one, and by the way, this really does happen in my job, and the person has a low IQ, 60s or 70s, but that person needed a personal aid and could never get a permit or a driver's license, and had few friends, and could never even fill out a job application, much less get a job, and would need help going to the cafeteria and to the bathroom. Wow, that's a person who lacks adaptive functioning. So those are the two criteria for an intellectual disability, not just an IQ below 70, plus or minus a few points, but also a lack of adaptive functioning. So we spent plenty of time on that one. Let's move on a little bit after I tell you this. Males outnumber females. It's about 60% of people with intellectual disabilities that are male. How does this happen? Well, some of it is genetics, or I should say more than some. A large percentage are either genetics or what we call early pregnancy factors. When the chromosomes start to develop and can be tested, we will notice that there are abnormalities like Down syndrome, also called trisomy 21, a third chromosome on what should be the 21st pair. That's usually where these intellectual disabilities start. Yes, they could be childhood factors of being abandoned or neglected, but usually they're either genetic, inborn, or early pregnancy factors. Moving right along. We are now going to talk real quickly about the normal curve of intelligence. When you get to the upper end, people who have an IQ over 130, gifted, 145, genius level, those are slightly more males than females. I know it sounds sexist and it doesn't sound fair, but that's what the research says. Well, remember what we just said about the low end of the curve? More males than females. Males tend to run the curve a little bit more than females do. That's not always true, but again, we're talking in terms of percentages. Now, the 4 levels of intellectual disability, it goes by 15 points of an IQ, but also it goes by adaptive functioning. So if you're below 85, well, that is 1 level or 1 standard deviation below average, and we would call you below average in your intellectual ability. But below 70, that's what used to be called mental retardation. We now call it intellectual disability. So 15 more points and 15 points after that, and keep going, we get different levels. Mild intellectual disability is usually an IQ at least 65 but below 70. Again, that's not always the case. It has to do with an intellectual disability. If I ever met a person who was able to graduate from high school with that kind of IQ, with no special ed classes, and get a driver's license and get a job, I would be thinking, maybe the test was wrong, because you should have some lack of adaptive functioning that would be very noticeable. You would be very childlike. So what is normal or expected when we see someone with an IQ between 65 and 70? Usually we can educate them to about the level of a 5th grader. And yeah, that includes social things too, like judgment. You ever been around a 5th grader? Some of them are pretty darn smart, aren't they? There used to be a game show, Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader? But that's kind of sad if that's about all you can achieve in your life, at the same time. Moderate. So now we're talking again, not exactly, but somewhere between 40 and 55 as an IQ score. I don't know if I said that right for mild. It would be more like 55 to 70, and mild 40 to 55, somewhere in that range, but again, the lack of adaptive functioning. So, what would we say? Well, maybe that they could be educated to about the judgment and academic skills of maybe a 2nd grader, a 7-year-old. Basic reading, basic adding and subtracting numbers, maybe learning how to use a basic cash register that doesn't have anything fancy on it for work, but still, probably not, because you would trust their judgment of being like a 7-year-old also. There are places called sheltered workshops where you put things together and you make money doing that a few hours a day. That's also sad when a person never evolves mentally and socially beyond a 7-year-old's ability levels. Severe. Now we're talking an IQ usually between 25 and 40, and really that person doesn't evolve more than a preschooler or maybe a kindergartner in some ways. teaching them to write their own name or how to use a microwave or a spoon and a fork. That would be an accomplishment even for an adult with severe intellectual disabilities. Maybe they can talk just a little bit, but not really to express themselves. Again, very sad. The lowest level, think of the normal curve, on the far lower end would be profound intellectual disabilities. And that is an IQ below 25, and all of their skills, socially, academically, and otherwise, would be more at an infant level. You've seen what people do when they show off with their infants, right? Can you touch your nose? Where are your eyes? That's like the limit of the skills of an infant, and you certainly hope that your infant will grow up and have better skills than that. But when someone has a profound intellectual disability, it's sad that they never evolve more than that. So think of how a normal curve is higher on the top and it gets lower as it goes down. Profound would be the most rare. Just like somebody being an extreme genius would be rare, profound is the most rare. Most people who have intellectual disabilities are in the mild range, thank goodness. And by the way, only 2% of all people have an intellectual disability. And then you consider that the majority of them are in the mild range, where they can maybe evolve to the level of a 5th grader with the right kind of training and assistance in their lives. Next, autism. It's now called autism spectrum disorder because it now includes what we used to call Asperger's disorder. You've probably heard of that. That's not a condition that we use in the same frame of reference anymore. We now call it autism spectrum disorder, and somebody with Asperger's who really just lacks social skills, adult-like social skills, they would be called high functioning on the autism spectrum. So what do we see in people with autism? A bunch of things. Communication problems. People with low functioning autism, they will often say nothing, or they'll do something called echolalia, just kind of repeating what they hear other people say, not forming their own thoughts. In higher functioning autism, what we used to call Asperger's, they will talk just fine, sometimes even too much. But what they'll talk about are things that are inappropriate. So that's something good to know. The communication patterns, depending on the level of severity. Socialization. As infants, they won't make eye contact. They won't seem to need attention or much of anything else. People might think, wow, I have such an easy baby. I'm so lucky. Maybe not. If that child grows up to not need socialization, that's a problem. That's not necessarily a good thing. It may seem like it for a little while. As they get older, tantrums are very common. They can't control their emotions. Even as adults, self-abusive behavior, hitting other people is less common. Hitting themselves is more common. Poor social skills around other people, doing dangerous things like, climbing up a light pole. Why on earth would you need to do that? Running away from home and not coming home just because you don't know any better. Social skill deficits that can even be dangerous. Motor behavior, maybe you've seen this in people with autism, of hand flapping or spinning in circles or something else that is just not necessary. Stereotyped behaviors, such as needing the same thing to happen over and over again. You can only eat one kind of cereal. You can only watch one TV show and it has to be at the same time every day. We call that preservation of sameness. That's in higher functioning autism, where they want the same thing to happen over and over and over again. They can't stand change or for anything to be any different. Most people with autism have intellectual disabilities. Not all. There are some that have what we call savant syndrome. They have crazy skills or abilities, either intellectually or with music or art or their memory in one specific area. They'll memorize everything. That would be savant syndrome. But what's more common is savant syndrome is rare. What's more common is intellectual disabilities. By the way, one more thing about autism that was only discovered more recently. Autism's been around for 100 years, the diagnosis. But more recently it was discovered 9 out of 10 people with any form of autism have real bad sensory issues. They can't stand certain colors, certain lights, certain sounds or smells. They're very strongly affected by sensory issues that most people wouldn't notice or wouldn't even care about. So if you're following in the book, we can skip to page 33, the next neurodevelopmental condition, attention deficit disorder, also known as ADD or ADHD. What is the difference? Well, the H, the hyperactivity. Some kids space out and they daydream. That's the ADD without the H. The other one is they're hyper, they're disruptive. Those are the most difficult kids for teachers to have in a class because they disrupt everyone. The kid with ADD is not learning anything either, really, because they space out and they daydream and they doodle, but that is slightly different. Usually this is diagnosed right around the age of 9 because parents and teachers keep hoping the kid will grow out of it. If you're like that when you're 6 or 7, yeah, that's kind of normal, especially for a boy. We see these conditions more in boys for sure. But 8, 9, 10 years old, yeah, you're supposed to be able to sit in a chair and read and do math and stay quiet and pay attention. The older you get, the more this becomes a problem. By the way, you're going to notice that in a lot of childhood disorders that we go over not only in this chapter, but other chapters as well. The older you get, the more the world expects of you. If you're a 4-year-old and you can't read, that's not nearly the problem as being a 14-year-old who can't read. If you're a 3-year-old and you're not potty trained, that's not nearly the same problem as a 10-year-old who's not potty trained. Well, same thing with ADD. Either you can't pay attention, or you're hyper, or you're both. The older you get, the more problematic it becomes in your life. Age 9 is when the most common time is for it to be diagnosed. Now, it's estimated about 6, maybe up to 10% of kids have this. More boys than girls. Different statistics say anything from 2 to 1, which would be 2/3, to 4 to 1, which would be, 80%? Regardless, it's much more of a boy thing. Can adults have this? Absolutely. But most grown-ups learn to deal with it. You can force yourself to pay attention. Maybe you find jobs that fit your personality. If you're hyper, something more active. If you're inattentive, something that you can work at your own pace. I once did an evaluation on a juvenile, and the mom said, that's kind of rare, a grown woman, unusual I should say, and rare. She had it, the hyperactive kind. And she said, my best job ever was working at a library. And I said, you've got to be kidding. You've got to be quiet and sit still. She goes, no, I volunteered to be the person to put all the books and magazines back. Oh, now I get it. You found a job that fit your personality. See, even in a library, who would have guessed? So the types of ADD are predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, or combined type. Now, I do evaluations on juvenile delinquents, and when they say I have ADD, sometimes they don't even let me finish my sentence. I'm like, okay, are you hyper, or do you just not have the ability to pay attention? Both. I'm like, oh, okay. So you could have both. We call that the combined type. You could be one, or the other, or both. Moving right along, if you like to follow along in the book while I'm going through it, page 39. We're now talking about nervous system conditions that impact your behavior, and the one specifically that I want you to know, Tourette's disorder, often called Tourette's syndrome. Having tics, twitching, vocalizations. There is one symptom that not everybody has. It's probably about 20% of people who have Tourette's have something called corporalia. You translate that into English, it means that you shout out swear words, obscenities, cuss words for no apparent reason. It's not like you're angry about something or you just hurt yourself and maybe then it would be socially slightly more appropriate. No, just for no apparent reason. It's like you can't help yourself. Now, this comes up in class when we meet in person. Can a kid be kicked out of school for that? Actually, yes. They still have to be accommodated because it's a disability, but they can be removed from the classroom if what they're doing is impacting the learning of everyone else. There's been some court cases about that. It's kind of surprising because we do want to help people with disabilities, but there is a point where it stops everybody else from learning too. And that kid needs a different environment, whether it's intentional or not. Next thing, communication disorders as part of neurodevelopmental conditions. The first one I want you to know, I am bummed they changed the name of this for the DSM-5. Childhood onset fluency disorder. What did it used to be called? Stuttering. Why did they change the name? I don't know. Maybe people who stutter couldn't say the word stuttering. I have no idea. They changed it. Childhood onset fluency disorder, that might be even harder to say, huh? But anyway, it's still acceptable to call it stuttering, even though it changed names. Seriously, one reason why they changed the name, stuttering means multiple things. Some people repeat syllables or have trouble what we call blocking, getting phrases and sentences out of their mouth. It could be a bunch of different things. Now, I disagree with your book a little bit here. It says it usually starts around the age of 5. I think that's when it starts to become noticeable as a disorder. If your 2-year-old says, I want water, well, that's not so unusual for a 2-year-old. But if your 5-year-old still talks that way, yeah, that's a problem. Your 10-year-old, even worse. What if they block instead? Instead of repeating things, it's more like, you want water? Yes. And they can't get the whole sentence out of their mouth. That's most likely why they changed the name of the term, because it means so many different things. But usually by the age of 5 is when we start diagnosing it, because you should have better and clear speech patterns by that age. Early on, it's often ignored. Oh, it's kind of cute. Maybe he'll grow out of it. But by the age of 5, yeah, we got a problem. Boys outnumber girls by about 3 to 1, 75% boys. A lot of these conditions we're talking about in this chapter are more of a boy thing. They really are. We're almost done with this chapter. The last thing I want you to know is specific learning disabilities. What does that mean? Well, you have a learning disability in an area where otherwise you are normal, average, or maybe even above average. Now, as a psychologist, here's one thing that drives me crazy. When I read reports from schools or even other psychologists, and the kid or adult has a very low IQ score, and they say also dyslexia, dyscalculia, spelling disability, no, that person is just low functioning. If everything else about you is normal or even above average, but you see words and letters backwards, dyslexia. You just cannot add numbers, it all gets jumbled up in your head, dyscalculia. So you don't need to know all the names of the learning disabilities, but what you do need to know is the important part of the diagnosis is that it is inconsistent with your intellectual abilities. So in other words, everything else about you says normality or even above average, except for this one deficit, be it reading, math, spelling, or whatever else. So that's it for chapter 1 of the book. It is important that you have the book so you know what to know and that you can follow along with what kinds of things are important for the test. That's it for this one. Take care.